In this video, I'll talk about the content of both Chapter 4 and 5, trying to point out some comparisons and contrasts of the two. I have seen in your discussion posts that a lot of people are writing about Columbus. I find that really interesting because if we were to think about how Augusta compares to these two cities, even if we just have no knowledge of gangs in Augusta, we're much closer to Columbus than we are to St. Louis. It's interesting that at the time that she was doing this research, there was no official recognition of female gang members in St. Louis, and that seems like a pretty late point in time for them to still be denying that girls are members of gangs, given that their history in St. Louis of gangs is a longer history, especially versus Columbus, right? There are more gangs there. They've been around for a longer period of time. They are larger gangs, and there are more gang members in that city. In Columbus, a little bit less is known about what's going on with gangs. And even at that point that she was doing her research, there were no recognized gangs, which kind of indicates they don't recognize a significant, substantial presence of the large sort of super gangs. Even though, when you talk to the girls, there are gangs, right? So, comparing in another way, the girls in Columbus were in gangs that were smaller, younger, and newer than in St. Louis, where gangs were larger. The people in them were older in age. The gangs themselves had a longer history, especially within the city of St. Louis. And there were more females in the gangs in St. Louis than in Columbus. When Jody uses the terminology predominantly male, she's basically talking about vast majority being male. Majority male would mean, well, the majority are male, but there are more females in a majority male gang than in a predominantly male gang. Okay, so she also discusses the definition of a gang in this chapter and the debates over how to define it. This discussion isn't that critical, I don't think, for our purposes, but it can be a source of confusion, so I'll go ahead and discuss it. Part of the discussion goes back to the potential issue of wannabes showing up in the research sample, which, as we know, didn't end up to be a huge issue, but there's only so much that we can even prove that it wasn't an issue. Girls essentially needed to be describing their gangs accurately and in a way that goes along with other descriptions in order for Jody to really know that they're a meaningful part of the gang. So Jody asked them, what makes your group a gang? And the girls had more specific answers than the gang scholars do when they ask that question more broadly. What the gang scholars say is, first, the group has to have a distinct collective identity that others refer to them by, and that provides them with a way to self-identify. So that can be evident in name and other signifiers, symbols, hand signs, and things of that nature. But it's not a sufficient definition, is it, right? Because lots of social groups have a distinct collective identity. Sports fans have a distinct collective identity. There's a name, there's a symbol. Colleges, fans of particular bands or musicians, fraternities even, countercultures, just to name a few. So that leads people to say, okay, well, is it a group with a distinct collective identity who commit crime? Well, How much crime? What kind of crime? What if it's nonviolent? What if it's deviance or delinquency but not actually crime? Many of the groups I mentioned before commit crime, but we don't consider fraternities a gang. We don't consider, sports fans a gang. There isn't any official recognition of, the Green Bay Packers, or a subset of the Green Bay Packers as a gang. Bands, Deadheads, right? Fans of the Grateful Dead. I mean, they're stigmatized as being drug users, and that's crime, but they're not on gang file anywhere. Side note, the Juggalos, who are fans of Insane Clown Posse, have actually been put on gang file in certain places, and the FBI does have like a Juggalo option for Juggalos who sort of fit the rest of these criteria. So that's not exactly right. So how about groups with a distinct collective identity who come together in order to commit crime? Well, that will only work if the group really did come together in order to commit crime, right? And that is just not the case for all gangs. It's something that happens, right? They commit crime when they come together, but to say that they formed in order to commit crime is, at the very least, an oversimplification of the multiple reasons why these groups form. And, you'd also be shooting yourself in the foot if you were sitting around with 3 people one day, 4 people one day, and said, we could really commit crime more effectively if we created a distinct collective identity for ourselves, because that right there is going to get you identified as a gang if you are caught, right? So you're shooting yourself in the foot. So basically the most common definition of a gang is Matt Klein's, and Jody's kind of articulation of that combines part of the last questions with an addition, right? Groups with a distinct collective identity who have been involved in a sufficient number of incidents to call forth a consistent negative response from the community. So, in looking at the themes that emerged in the girls' responses to Jody's question about what made their gang a gang, you see some of these elements in there, right? Symbolism, recognition, right? People call us that, and we call ourselves that. But that there's also other things that go along with that recognition, that there's some status, that there's respect, at least from certain people, and at least in the minds of these girls. There's protection, and that's a tricky one that a lot of you have focused in on in the discussion posts, and we're going to come back to that in a little while later on in the book. It's a group that has a rivalry with another group, right? That's how you know it's a gang. There's a rivalry between the 2 rival gangs, or more than one rival gang. And then, of course, yes, they did mention crime. Now, you also see Jody talk about the formation of these groups, and it goes along with what we were discussing in Chapter 1, where you see more of that copycat model, the role of media and popular culture in Columbus, and you see a little bit of it as well in St. Louis, but again, that played a role after the groups independently formed, right? So you can take a look at this, and this slide kind of reiterates what we've talked about before. Although it does give you a reminder as to which gangs had a presence in these communities. And there's some difference there. There's more Crips and Bloods who originated out in Los Angeles, in St. Louis. In Columbus, you see more of a tie to gangs out of Chicago, which makes sense given that Columbus is closer to Chicago than they are to St. Louis. But it is interesting that you don't see, you see the LA influence in St. Louis, even though St. Louis is much closer to Chicago than it is to LA. Another thing that people usually point out in discussions is just being sort of shocked that the girls didn't know very much about the actual origination of their gangs. And I guess that kind of speaks to they're young, they aren't maybe caring about the history. Maybe they were just more in the immediate mindset. Another thing that she talks about in these chapters is, descriptions of how people get into the gang, what are the valued characteristics. In Columbus, the initiations were harsher, more formal, more ritualized. You have to take a set number of blows, or you have to fight for a certain amount of time, or you have to be subjected to, you had to be beaten for a certain amount of time, or you have to commit a crime in order to be initiated. In St. Louis, there was more fluidity. It was less ritualistic, less formal, more mixture of things like you got to get a tattoo and you've got to, steal something. Some mixture was more common, and some even said that there were no initiations. That there are strong neighborhood ties in St. Louis, and so if you grew up in that area and you wanted to claim, and they had their process of kind of vetting you to know if you were going to be somebody that they can rely on, then they didn't necessarily need to subject you to the violence as a means of proving yourself. In Columbus, that was way more common, right? And I think it's interesting to note those two differences, given what we know about the gender composition of the gangs, right? There are more males in the Columbus gangs and more formal and violent, physical assault involved in the initiations versus St. Louis, where there are more women in the gangs. Something interesting there, right? We also learn about the status and hierarchy. So a lot of gangs don't have a really advanced level of organization such that there's levels and tiers of leaders and followers. A lot of gangs just have one leader, basically. And you see a mixture of that in here. But you do see some clear patterns such that in St. Louis there were more females represented in leadership roles. And some gangs had no one single leader. Shared leadership, which is really interesting, especially, again, given there are more women in those gangs. In Columbus, there was always one leader. They always had a leader. They were almost all male, and there were very few females who were near the top. Basically, we see throughout, and we will continue to see this in the coming chapters, that in order for girls to gain status, they really did, and gain, leadership positions, they had to have a tie to a male somehow, or they had to act very, in a very masculine way. And thus, you see the glass ceiling. apparent, especially in the Columbus gangs.